and first, that means the coming of the Europeans. യൂറോപ്യന്മാർ ഇന്ത്യയിൽ വന്നതിനെ കുറിച്ചാണ്. കമ്മിങ് ഓഫ് യൂറോപ്യൻസ് എന്തൊക്കെയാണ് നോക്കാം. To acquaint yourself with, look at this, എന്തൊക്കെയാണ് യൂറോപ്യൻ interactions with Indian states and society from 1600 to 1715. യൂറോപ്യൻ interactions ആണ്. Commercial networks and institutions in India in the early modern period. The commercial networks and institutions in India, there were many commercial networks and institutions in India in the early modern period. And the Indian ports and their importance in the Indian Ocean trade, the impact of the entry of European trading companies. They were the trading companies and on Indian merchants and trade and commerce. Then the Portuguese trade interest in India, the impact of Portuguese and Dutch presence in India, then rivalry and wars between the French and the Dutch. The rivalry and wars between French and Dutch. Then the colonial settlements of Denmark and their importance. The rivalry and wars between, that is the rivalry and wars. There were rivalries and wars between French and Dutch. The impact of Portuguese and Dutch presence in India. Then let's have a look. Okay, then French and Dutch. These days bilateral uh, meetings and Modi's visitors going on and in France, and there were many MOUs were signed between India and France. The colonial settlements of Denmark and their importance. Clashes over trading monopoly between the French and the British in the Carnatic region. The colonial settlements of Dutch, that is Denmark, and their importance. Clashes over trading monopoly between the French and the British in the Carnatic region. The clashes over trading monopoly between the French and the British, between French and the British in the Carnatic region. There were clashes over trading monopoly between the French and the British in the Carnatic region. Then the emergence of England as an undisputed power after the three Carnatic wars. England as an undisputed power. So these things are to be discussed here. So listen. The first is the about introduction. It says the beginning of British rule in India is conventionally ascribed to 1757 after the Battle of Plassey was won by the English East India Company against the Nawab of Bengal. But the Europeans had arrived in India by the beginning of the 16th century, but they arrived in India by the beginning of the 16th century. So their original intention was to procure pepper, cinnamon, cloves, and other spices for the European markets and participate in the trade of the Indian Ocean. So the Portuguese were the first Europeans to establish themselves in India. Vasco da Gama discovered their direct sea route to India from Europe around the Cape of Good Hope of Africa at the end of the 15th century, that is 1600. So subsequently the Portuguese conquered Goa on the 15th century, that is 1400s. So subsequently the Portuguese conquered Goa on the west coast in 1510. So Goa then became the political headquarters of Portuguese in India and further east in Malacca and Java. Malacca Straits, you remember? Yes, that's it. So the Portuguese preferred a pattern of controlling the Indian Ocean trade through a combination of political aggressiveness and naval superiority. Their forts at Daman and Diu enabled them to control the shipping in the Arabian Sea. The forts at Daman and Diu enabled them to control the shipping at the Arabian Sea. So, using their well-armed ships, and they were having well-armed ships. So, the other European nations who came to India nearly a century later, especially they were the Dutch and English. So, the first one were the Portuguese. We have to change the color here. The Portuguese can be read. Then it's now Dutch and then English, especially the Dutch and English. They modeled their activities on the Portuguese blueprint. Thus, we need to understand the advent of the European trading companies as an ongoing process of engagement with the Indian political authorities, local merchants, and society, which culminated in the conquest of Bengal by the British in 1757 by the Battle of Plassey. So, this lesson has two parts: the political history of India and the changing scenario that emerged after 1600. So let's see that the lesson has two parts: the political history of India and the changing scenario that emerged after 1600, and political history. They are discussed in the first part, and the second part deals with the arrival of European trading companies. Okay, these are the things. The first and the second: arrival of trading companies, European trading companies in India, and the impact each one made on Indian society. Okay, so the political affairs, the Mughal Empire from 1600 to 1650. Let's look at this. Okay, this was the period when Mughal Empire was at the peak of its power. So, from 1600 to 1650, peak of its power, the Europeans were quite uh, aware of the wealth and power of the Mughals, and the English poets even wrote about the fabulous wealth of India. Travelers from all parts of Europe visited India regularly during the 16th and 17th centuries, and the journals of their travels present a detailed contemporary account of the empire and society in India. The journals of their travels, it present a empire and society in India. By 1600, Akbar had achieved his imperial dream and extended the frontiers of the Mughal Empire through his conquests. So, by 1600, what happened? Akbar, Babur, Humayun, Akbar, Jahangir, Shah Jahan. So, the third one, Babur, Humayun, Akbar. So, Akbar had achieved his imperial dream and extended the frontiers of the Mughal Empire through his conquests in Rajasthan and Gujarat. So Gujarat, he conquered Rajasthan and Gujarat, and Gujarat was conquered in 1573, and this gave the Mughal Empire valuable access to the port of Surat, which was the gateway to West Asia and Europe. So, besides trade, the ships carrying pilgrims to Mecca left from the Surat. There were trade, and also the pilgrims to Mecca were also there. They were left from Surat. So the port of Surat. The importance of Surat to the Mughals can be appreciated from the fact that Surat had two governors. So the importance of Surat to the Mughals can be appreciated from the fact that Surat had two governors, one the governor of the city and the other the governor of the castle. So, Surat had two governors. The importance of Surat to the Mughals can be appreciated from the fact that Surat had two governors. Okay. um, one governor of the city and the other governor of the castle, which had been built on the river. This is Surat, okay, Gujarat, and it is built on the river Tapti to protect the city, the castle, British factory. So the governor of the city was in charge of civilian affairs, the governor of the city and the governor of the castle. So civilian affairs and the revenues from customs duties. So next is uh, look at Akbar had also tried to extend his empire in the east beyond Bihar by conquering Bengal. So, but Bengal was not really integrated into the empire until nearly 3 decades later when it became one of the provinces, that is Subha, not Sabha but Subha, under Jahangir. So, Baba Humayun, Akbar Jahangir. So, when it became one of the provinces under Jahangir, then only the Bengal came to be a part of the Mughal Empire. Under Akbar, the revenue system of the empire had been revamped by the Todermal so that it's revamped so that the unified system of governance and revenue collection and the revenue collection could function throughout the empire. And at his death, so what he made, he the revenue system, it is revamped by Todermal so that the unified system of governance and revenue collection could function throughout the empire. At his death, therefore, Akbar left a powerful, economically prosperous, and well administrated empire. So Akbar was the most powerful uh, emperor of Mughal Empire, and Af- so after his death, he left with a powerful, economically prosperous, and well-administered empire, not only in economic but also in administration level. Also, he was very well. And then the Dutch, followed by the English, arrived in Surat. First was it was Portuguese, then the Dutch, followed by the English. Then they arrived in Surat. So this is which happened after the arrival of Portuguese. Then came the Dutch. Before I think before Akbar, the arrival of Portuguese, it may happened. Okay, the it might happen before his tenure of Akbar, because in 1400 and in 15th century AD, the Portuguese came to India, and the Dutch, followed by the English, arrived in Surat in the early years of the 1600s. So the Dutch, followed by the English, they arrived in Surat in the early years of the 1600s. So Dutch, followed by whom? English, they arrived in Surat itself in the early years of the 1600s to begin their trading activities. So what is that? Mughal governor permitted them to trade and to set up their factories. So they came to Surat and to begin their trading activities. But the Mughal governor, there were two governors for civil and one was for the castle and one for the administration of castle. So the Mughal governor, it is done by um, Akbar in Surat, and the Mughal governor permitted them to trade and to set up their factories. What is the Mughal governor? He permitted them to trade and to set up their factories. That's one thing. They permitted for trade and to set up their factories. But you should see how much they utilized it, misused it. You will see that. And as the business premises of the European traders, which also functioned as warehouses, were termed, as warehouses were termed. Then, by but they were not allowed to have any territorial authority over any part of the city. They were not having any territorial authority. These Dutch and English were traders, and over any part of the city. And this frustrated their ambitions to follow the Portuguese model. They were interested to follow the Portuguese model in India. So the English acquired the islands of Bombay in 1668. Islands of Bombay in 1668 and set up their headquarters in Bombay in 1687. Okay, in 1687. Their primary objective was to develop Bombay as an alternate base for their operations. But Surat, under the protection of the Mughal state, still remained the preferred center of commercial activity for the merchants. And then South India after Vijayanagar. We should see this. For, from 1600 to 1650. From India after Vijayanagar. So South India, especially the Tamil region, presented a sharp contrast to the centralized stability of the Mughal Empire. So South India, especially the Tamil region, it presented a sharp contrast to the centralized stability of the Mughal Empire in these decades. The Mughal Empire, it was centralized during the tenure of Akbar, and but the South India, especially the Tamil region, it was not centralized. It was a kind of decentralization, like Chera, Chola, Pandyas, and all princely states were there, and the politically the region was fragmented and unsettled. And under Vijayanagar rule, three Nayak kingdoms had been um, set up in the Tamil region, Nayaks. And they were Madurai, Tanjavur, and Sanchi. It's Senji, written as Senji but pronounced as Sanchi. And the objective was to provide financial and manpower resources to the empire. So it was the Vijayanagar rule. Under the Vijayanagar rule, three Nayak kingdoms were there. It was decentralized, and the three Nayak kingdoms were there under the Vijayanagar rule. So the objective was to provide financial and manpower resources to the empire. Okay. After the defeat of Vijayanagar in 1568 in the Battle of Talikota, defeat of Vijayanagar. Okay, by the combined forces of the rulers of Ahmednagar, Bijapur, and Golconda, and the central authority of the once dominant kingdom became very weak then, and the Nayak kingdoms became virtually autonomous, and though they made a ritualistic acknowledgement of the authority of the Vijayanagar emperor, they were become almost independent. So these three Nayak kingdoms under Vijayanagar, which was defeated by the combined forces of the Ahmednagar, Bijapur, and Golconda in 1568 in the Battle of Talikota. In addition to the larger Nayak kingdoms, several local chiefs also controlled. So you should listen this. That is, in addition to the larger Nayak kingdoms, which were the three Nayak kingdoms, they were Madurai, Tanjavur, and Senji. So these, in addition to the larger Nayak kingdoms, several local chiefs also controlled some parts of the region. The most notable of them was probably the Setupati of Ramanathapuram, who was also keen to assert his independence. And between 1590 and 1649, the region witnessed several military conflicts arising out of these unsettled political conditions. And Madurai and Tanjavur they fought several times to establish their superiority. There were also rebellions against the Vijayanagar emperor. There were rebellions, and Besides these ongoing conflicts, Golconda invaded the Coromandel in 1646 and annexed the area between Pulicat and Santhome, which also changed the political scenario in the region. So, Golconda. There were Madurai, Tanjavur, and Sanchi. So, here the Madurai and Tanjavur they fought several times to establish their superiority, and then the Golconda invaded the Coromandel in 1646. Coromandel was invaded by Golconda, and um, it was the and annexed the areas between the Pulicat and Santhome. Okay, so has changed the political scenario of that region. Then came the Dutch and the English. They were able to acquire territorial rights on the east coast during these years. They were not having any administrative rights or territorial rights in any area in any region in India, but only trade activities were allowed and to set up a factory in India. But they were interested to make a Portuguese model of administration in India. They were looking for that, and the Dutch and English they were able to acquire territorial rights on East Coast during these years. Okay, and in the East Coast, and they were able to acquire that territorial rights. So they realized that they need a base on the Coromandel Coast to access what Coromandel costs peace goods. To access the peace goods needed for trading with the spice producing islands of Indonesia. Hmm. So there were spice producing islands of Indonesia, and the Dutch had successfully negotiated to acquire Pulicat. They and that is Palaverkad from Nayaks of Senji. It was Senji, Nayaks of Senji, okay, Sanji or Senji. And the Dutch they successfully negotiated to acquire the Pulicat from the Nayaks of Senji, and they constructed a fort there. And the English got a piece of land further south from the local chief and Damarla Venkadadri Nayak, on which they built the Fort St. George in 1639. Fort St. George. Okay. Then this an English settlement came up, which eventually grew into Chennai, or that is uh, the then Madras, and the capital of the Madras Presidency. So, and who made the Dutch? They successfully negotiated the Pulicat, and from Pulicat that is Palaverkad, Palaverkad from Nayaks of Senji, and then. The English they got piece of island farther south from the local chief that is Damarla Venkadadri Nayak, on which they built Saint Forge in 1639. Okay, there were another name of person Saint Tom Pulicat and Saint Thoma Saint Tome. Okay, so who bought Pulicat from Nayaks of Senji? From the Nayaks of Senji, there were three Nayaks, and from the Nayaks of Senji, Dutch they bought the Pulicat, that is Palaverkad. Okay, so from 1650 to 1700, what is happening? Just look at the that is for Saint George. British built it. Okay, by acquiring the land from Dharmala Venkadadri Nayak. Okay, he was the local chief. This is for St. George. Okay. Then in 1650 to 1700, the Mughal Empire. What is that? Emperor Aurangzeb began an ambitious program of extending his empire. So next is Aurangzeb. We know Babur, Humayun, Akbar, Jahangir, Aurangzeb. Babur, Humayun, Akbar, Jahangir, Shahjahan evren. Babur, Humayun, Akbar, Jahangir, Shahjahan, Aurangzeb. Isn't it? Babur, Humayun, Akbar, Jahangir, Shahjahan, and Aurangzeb. Okay. And the emperor, the last emperor that we can say almost not the last emperor exactly is Bahadur Shah, but the powerful of this ones, the last one, it is likewise considered as it is. So the Emperor Aurangzeb from the 1650 to 1700, what was? The Aurangzeb began an ambitious program of extending his empire south to the Deccan and the kingdoms of Ahmednagar, Baijapur, Golconda. They were conquered in the 80s, and this extended the Mughal control of the Deccan of a far south as Chennai. They reached even Chennai. But what happened? But overextended Mughal empire soon began to reveal its inherent weaknesses because it wasn't able to be a centralized empire. So this became most apparent when Marathas under Shivaji began to grow in power and military strength. And they attacked Surat with impunity in 1664, though it was soon abandoned. But their second raid, so you should see that the emergence of Shivaji, Marathas under the Shivajis, okay, they were becoming powerful. Uh, from 1650 to 1700, that is Aurangzeb. So they attacked Surat in 1664, but it was abandoned. And so you should know that the Aurangzeb, he expanded the territory to even South Deccan and even up to Chennai, but this made the disintegration of Mughal Empire because it wasn't able to control. Since the administration, though the administration was very powerful and the economy also, the large kingdom wasn't able to be controlled by one ruler. That was the reason. It was because of the large expansion of this empire, and then it came to the arrival of emergence of Shivaji, who was as a leader of Marathas. And but their second raid in 1670 devastated Surat, and its trade took several years to recover. Okay, this seriously challenged the claim of Mughal invincibility, and it sounded the beginning of the gradual disintegration of the Mughal Empire. So, this seriously challenged the claim of Mughal invincibility, that is Ajaya Maitala. They weren't able to be what defeated. That was the concept, that was the thought. It was prevailing those years, those centuries actually, not years, decades or centuries, that they were expanding the territories even to south, to east, to west. And so they were known as, they were a kind of invincible those days. And but the Marathas, for in their second raid in Surat, they were they took several years to recover. So they devastated Surat. Okay, and its trade took several years to recover. So the trade was some kind of reducing its gloriness there because they weren't able to um, go back to the previous days of that trade days or under the Mughal Empire when it was um, raided by the Shivajis of Maratha. This seriously challenged the claim of Mughal invincibility, and it sounded the beginning of the gradual disintegration of the Mughal Empire. So, the gradual disintegration of Mughal Empire was started by the second attack of Shivaji of Maratha in 1670 when they attacked Surat. And it took several years for Surat to um, uh, to recover from this devastation. And after the attack on Surat, Shivaji turned his attention to South India and defeated the Nayaks of Senji and Tanjavur. And then, though Senji was conquered by the Mughals in a few years later, Tanjavur survived as a Maratha ruled state itself. So, Tanjavur was a Maratha ruled state. Well, it's in the South India still, but it was ruled by the Marathas. Okay, the Maratha kings, with their inclusive policy of assimilating Tamil intellectual and cultural traditions, made Tanjavur the cultural capital of the Tamil region. You should also understand this, that even though it was ruled by the Marathas, they made Tanjavur as the cultural capital of the Tamil region. That is the beauty of their ruling. So they were, as we said, there were three Nayaks were there, which were the Battle of Talikota that we have already read. There were three Nayaks were there, which were Madurai, Tanjavur, and Senji. So this Senji and Tanjavur, they defeated the Nayaks of Senji and Tanjavur. Uh, who the Surat and Shivaji, that after the attack of Surat, Shivaji turned his attention to South India and defeated the Nayaks of Senji and Tanjavur, not Madurai, except Madurai, uh, Tanjavur, and Senji. Though Senji was conquered by the Mughals a few years later, Tanjavur survived as the Maratha ruled state. It remained as the Maratha ruled state, which was Tanjavur. Senji was conquered by the Mughal later. Then the Tanjavur remained as the cultural capital of the Tamil region, which was under the rule of Marathas. That is Shivaji of Maratha. Then the Mughal Empire and the successor states. Okay. എന്താണെന്ന് നോക്കാം. The Mughal Empire and the successor states. അടുത്തതാണ്. ബാക്കി വരുന്ന ഇപ്പം നമ്മൾ പറഞ്ഞു അക്ബറും ഹുമയൂണും നമ്മൾ ജഹാംഗീർ വരെയുള്ളത് എത്തി അല്ലേ, ഔറംഗസേബ് വരെയുള്ളത് എത്തി. ബാബർ, ഹുമയൂൺ, അക്ബർ, ജഹാംഗീർ, ഷാജഹാൻ ആൻഡ് ഔറംഗസേബ്, ദ സിക്സ്ത് വൺ. അപ്പോൾ ലാസ്റ്റ് സിക്സ്ത് വണ്ണിലെത്തി. അപ്പം തന്നെ ഔറംഗസേബിന്റെ കാലഘട്ടത്തിലാണ് ഡിസിൻറ്റഗ്രേഷൻ തുടങ്ങുന്നത്. പക്ഷേ ഔറംഗസേബ് വാസ് എ പവർഫുൾ റൂളർ ആൻഡ് ഹീ കോൺകേർഡ് ഈവൻ സൗത്ത് ഓൾസോ. അങ്ങനെ അത് കൺട്രോളിങ് നഷ്ടപ്പെടാനുള്ള സാധ്യത, അതായത് വൈഡ് കിങ്ഡം ആയപ്പോൾ കൺട്രോളിങ് നഷ്ടപ്പെടുകയും അങ്ങനെ ശിവാജി ഓഫ് മറാത്ത കെയിം ടു സൂറത്ത് ആൻഡ് കോൺകേർഡ് ആൻഡ് ദേ അറ്റാക്ക്ഡ് ദർ. അതുകൊണ്ടാണ് ഈ 1600കളിൽ എന്തുണ്ടാകുന്നത്, ഈ മുഗൾ എംപയറിന്റെ ഡിസിൻറ്റഗ്രേഷൻ തുടങ്ങുന്നത്. പിന്നീട് ശിവജി ഈവൻ കെയിം ടു, പിന്നീട് ശിവജിയാണ് വരുന്നത് സൗത്തിലേക്ക്. ഹി came to Tanjavur also and conquered there, and the Tanjavur became as the capital of the cultural capital of Tamil region. But the Senji was then conquered by the Mughal later. അങ്ങനെയാണ്, അങ്ങനെ അത് അങ്ങോട്ടും ഇങ്ങോട്ടും ആയിക്കൊണ്ട് കഴിക്കാം. ഓക്കെ, so the next comes the 1700 to 1750. What happened in Mughal Empire? That is to be noted here. Okay. So next is the Mughal Empire and the successor states. Okay, Mughal Empire and the successor states. Aurangzeb, the last of the great Mughals. So he was the last of great Mughals, 1700 to 1750. Aurangzeb died in 1707. One of the major developments following his death was the establishment of what have been called successor states. Mughal viceroys in various parts of the country, Mughal viceroys, not British, Mughal viceroys in various parts of the country, that is Oudh, Bengal, Hyderabad, and the Carnatic set themselves up as independent rulers. Okay, the English and the Dutch had understood this vulnerability of the Mughal state. In Bengal and Carnatic, Nawabs had borrowed heavily from whom? From the English, and assigned vast tracts of land to them. Okay, so they had borrowed heavily from English and assigned vast tracts of land to them so that the English could collect the land revenue repayment for the loans. This marks the beginning of British rule as revenue collectors. So in Bengal and the Carnatic, Bengal, the Nawabs had borrowed heavily from the English, that's the thing, and assigned vast tracts of land to them so that the English could collect the land revenue as repayment for the loans. So they assigned vast tracts of land to them so that the English could collect the land revenue as repayment for their loans. So they borrowed heavily from the English and assigned vast tracts of land to them. So this marks the beginning of British rule as revenue collectors. So this marks the beginning of British rule as revenue collectors. They were known as the collectors. They were actual collectors of that time. The name Carnatic originally referred to the region occupied by the Kannada speaking people. In the 18th century, it included the region lying between Eastern Ghats and the Western Ghats in the modern Indian states of Tamil Nadu, Karnataka, and southern Andhra Pradesh. Tamil Nadu, Karnataka, and southern Andhra Pradesh. So, the Nawab of Arcot controlled this region. So, listen, the name Carnatic it originally referred to the region occupied by the Kannada speaking people. In the 18th century, it included the region lying between the Eastern Ghats and the Western Ghats in the modern Indian states of Tamil Nadu, Karnataka, and the southern part of the region of Andhra Pradesh. And the Nawab of Arcot controlled this region. That is the thing here. So after the death of Aurangzeb, the great Mughals, he was what the last of great Mughals. He died in 1707, and the major development after his death was the establishment of successive states. That is the Mughal viceroys in various parts of the country. That is Oudh, Bengal, Hyderabad, and the Carnatic. They set themselves as independent rulers, and independent states were assigned to them. They themselves assigned it. So the English and Dutch they understood this vulnerability of the Mughal state. So in Bengal and Carnatic, the Nawabs had borrowed heavily from the English, and this made to the land revenue as repayment for the loans. They were heavily debted to the borrowed heavily from the English. So this marks the beginning of English rule as the revenue collectors. British rule as revenue collectors. Then this is the beginning of revenue collectors. So what is the Kannada speaking region? That is the Tamil Nadu, Karnataka, and southern Andhra Pradesh. It is the um, what Carnatic region. The Nawab of Arcot controlled this region. Okay. Next is by this time the Dutch had given up Pulicat and moved their headquarters further south to Nagapattinam. Okay, so you listen. By this time, the Dutch had given up Pulicat and moved their headquarters further south to Nagapattinam, and they had decided to what shift their focus to the spice producing islands of Indonesia and established their capital at Jakarta, that is Batavia. And Chennai, in the meantime, had grown into a prosperous town. The English, after many years of struggle, became a power to reckon with it in the region. And to reckon with in the region, the English. after many struggles. So, Surat continued to suffer. How? The Surat continued to suffer due to the uncertain political conditions. Okay, Surat continued to suffer due to the uncertain political conditions, and Surat is still in suffering, still suffering. Then, not still, it was the port. This is the Surat, it continued to suffer due to the uncertain political conditions. And by 1750, the local merchants, the Surat, it continued to suffer due to the uncertain political conditions. And by 1750, the local merchants, uncertain political conditions were there, and the local merchants had begun to declare themselves to be under protection of the Dutch. And the merchants, they had begun to declare themselves to be under the protection of the Dutch or the English in order to feel more secure. So the Bombay therefore became a viable alternative as a trade center, attracting merchants from the Surat and other parts of Gujarat. Hence, Bombay has emerged as the main center of trade in that period, the emergence of Bombay as the trade center. So, Nagapattanam in 1702. So, just listen. Next comes the economy, agriculture. India was primarily an agricultural economy. Most of the population lived in the rural areas and they depended on agriculture for their livelihood. So, in addition to food grains, they grew several commercial crops, and these included sugarcane. Commercial crops are sugarcane, oil seeds, cotton, indigo. The sugarcane is a commercial crop, and there was a brisk trade in food grains, ghee, sugar, and other food products from the surplus areas to the deficit areas within India. And food grains, particularly, were transported on coastal boats, and the Tamil region, for instance, imported food grains from the Andhra region. So, um, for instance, important food grains from the Andhra region and Bengal. Okay. So, on the west coast, food grains from Gujarat were exported to the Malabar region, and in return for pepper, cinnamon, and ginger. Then the food grains were also shipped to the Dutch establishments in Sri Lanka and Batavia in Indonesia. They were shipped to the Dutch establishments in Sri Lanka and Batavia in Indonesia. The Dutch, they transferred their focus from India to Indonesia. We have already seen that, isn't? Yes. Next comes the cotton manufacture. Okay, let's see what it is. So the cotton manufacturers. Cotton India also had a strong manufacturing base and was particularly famous for the variety of cotton fabrics produced at various centers across the country. Okay, India also had a strong manufacturing base. So the cotton is India also had a strong manufacturing base and was particularly famous for the variety of cotton fabrics produced at various centers across the country. Listen once more. India also had a strong manufacturing base and was particularly famous for the variety of cotton fabrics produced at various centers across the country. Mm, Base, a strong manufacturing base, and particularly famous for the variety of cotton fabrics. So, weaving was the second most important economic activity in the country, supported by subsidiary activities like spinning, dyeing, manufacturing, that is a handicraft production, was carried on both in urban and rural areas. Luxury crafts like metalwork were urban based. Weaving was mostly done in rural areas. Okay. Manufacturing, that is the handicraft production, listen once more. It was carried on both in urban and rural areas. Luxury crafts like metalwork were urban based. So the luxury crafts like metalwork, they were urban based. So weaving was mostly done in rural areas. So the luxury crafts like metalwork, they were urban based. So listen, luxury crafts like metal work were urban based. Weaving was mostly done in rural areas. Okay. So listen, the luxury crafts like metal work were urban based. Okay. The luxury crafts like metal work were urban based and weaving was mostly done in rural areas. The luxury crafts like metal work were urban based and they were luxury crafts, it is it's saying like that. Okay, you just listen. uh, Sorry, the system has got stuck. No. The luxury crafts like metalwork were urban based. Okay, and weaving was mostly done in rural areas. Okay, yes, that is weaving. It was mostly done in rural areas. India had a great advantage in that cotton was grown in our country. India had a great advantage in that cotton was grown in our country. That like Indian craft communities also possessed specialized knowledge about dyeing cotton using chemicals like alum to produce a permanent color. So the Coromandel region was famous for its painted kalamkari fabrics. Kalamkari, the black, yes, using curries. Coromandel region, I guess so. No, it's the Coromandel region was famous for kalamkari fabrics, which had designs drawn on the cloth and then it is dyed. By the 16th century, this had become staple products for consumers in South Asia and especially the Indonesian islands because of this Dutch people. So, cotton fabrics were the most important exports from all part of India to the rest of the world. This continued well into the 18th century. Okay, so the marketing, while saying about the marketing, production for an external market was widespread. So the production for an external market it was widespread. Okay, so that there was high degree of commercialization of production beyond subsistence levels. So this required the organization of marketing by agencies which were distinct from the producers. Okay, this required the organization of marketing by agencies which were distinct from the producers. This, listen once again, this required the organization of marketing by agencies, okay, which were distinct from the producers. That is a class of merchants. So, this required the organization of marketing by agencies which were distinct from the producers. That is a class of merchants. There were merchants. So, required the organization of marketing by agencies which were distinct from the producers. That is a class of merchants. So merchants thus linked producers who were dispersed in the rural areas with urban markets within the country and with external markets outside the country. And the extensive trade network in the country operated in several circuits from the village markets to to regional markets and large urban commercial centers, culminating in the ports, which were the gateways to the markets outside the country. Okay, okay, merchant groups. Next is just as the various kinds of markets functioned at different scales, merchants were also not a homogeneous group. There were traders and retailers who serviced markets, okay, in small centers. So just listen, if mercantile activity can be deemed to be a pyramid, this class of merchants would be the base of the pyramid. At its top were the great merchants who were the prime movers in overseas trade with the great reserves of capital, who controlled the producers in the hinterland of the ports. They controlled the producers in the hinterland of the ports. They generally employed the services of a network of brokers and sub-brokers to acquire goods from the interior regions or hinterland of the port towns. Okay, so they generally employed the services of a network of brokers, sub-brokers, and to acquire goods from the interior regions or hinterland of the port towns. So these agents could be said to form the middle tier of the merchant pyramid. Okay, so listen, banking and the rise of merchant capitalists. So the commercial institutions were also well developed to promote such extensive trade. You listen, the commercial institutions were also well developed to promote such extensive trade. Okay, commercial institutions. So there were institutions. Because a variety of coins were in circulation, there were money changers or shroffs. Because a variety of coins were in circulation, there were money changers or shroffs to test coins for their purity and decide their value in current terms. So, because a variety of coins were in circulation, so there were money changers or shroffs. They were known as shroffs, the money changers, to test the coins for purity and decide their value in current terms. They also served as local bankers. Okay, to test the purity and decide the value in current terms. They were money changers or shroffs. The best variety of coins were there. And instead of transferring money as cash from one place to another, merchants issued bills of exchange known as hundis, which would be cashed by shroffs at different destinations. They were known as hundis. Instead of transferring money as cash from one place to another, merchants issued bills of exchange. So instead of transferring money as cash from one place to another, merchants issued bills of exchange known as hundis, which would be cashed by shroffs at different destinations at a specified rate of discount. So instead of transferring money as cash from one place to another, the merchants they issued bills of exchange known as hundis, which would be cashed by shroffs at different destinations at a specified rate of discount. So they So the next is this well-developed infrastructure and organization of trade enabled the rich merchants to amass large fortunes. Such merchant princes or capitalists were found in all parts of India. The Banias and Parsi merchants of Surat. So, such merchant princes or capitalists were found in all parts of India. The Banias and Parsi merchants of Surat, the Nagar Seth of Ahmedabad, and Jagat Seths of Bengal, and the merchant communities of the Coromandel. So, contemporary European observers they noted that these merchants they appropriated all the profits from trade to themselves, only to them, while the earnings and condition of the weavers and peasants were pitifully poor. This rendered them especially vulnerable to natural calamities like famines. In the Madras region, for instance, famine occurred at least 10 times between 1678 and 1750. sometimes there was widespread famine which lasted for several years on end. This drove the rural poor to sell themselves into slavery. So Dutch records from the Coromandel regularly mention male and female slaves among the cargo sent to Batavia. So the Dutch records from the Coromandel regularly mention the Dutch records from the Coromandel. Okay, the Dutch records from the Coromandel it regularly mention the Coromandel Coast. Okay, Coromandel regularly mentioned male and female slaves among the cargo sent to Batavia. Slaves were the human slaves. Okay, and the overseas trade, what it is? The overseas trade from both the east and west coast was incorporated into Indian Ocean trade, which had stabilized into a well set pattern by the 16th century. So, overseas trade from both the east and west coast was incorporated into Indian Ocean trade, okay, which had stabilized into a well set pattern by the 16th century. So, shipping in the Indian Ocean was segmented and carried on over several demarcated stages. It was segmented. So, the ships coming from China and other Far East sailed up to Malacca where their cargoes were unloaded, and in return, goods from the west were taken back. So, listen again, the ships coming from the China and their Far East sailed up to Malacca where their cargoes were unloaded, and in return, the goods from the west were taken back. From Malacca, so the ships sailed to the west coast of India to Calicut or Cambay or Gujarat or Surat in Gujarat, and such intermediate ports were known as entree ports. So Malacca was an entree port. So goods from Europe and West Asia they were exchanged in these ports for goods from the east as well as locally produced pepper, spices, dyes, clothes, and food grains. So, in the 16th century, Calicut, it lost out to the Gujarat ports, which were served by much larger hinterland, producing a wider range of products. So, the products of the Coromandel coast, like Masulipatanam, Pulicat, and other ports further south served as intermediate ports known as entree ports for the ships from Burma and the Malay Peninsula. Okay, Burma and Malay Peninsula, that is Malaysia, is there in the Malay Peninsula. So the Coromandel coast, that is the Masulipatanam Pulicat. So advent of Europeans. So next is about the advent of Europeans. So listen, the arrival of the Europeans, that is beginning with the Portuguese, was the first major arrival of Europeans. The beginning with the Portuguese, it was the first major external shock to this well established and regulated system of trade. So, it was the first major external shock to this well established and regulated system of trade because it was a shock actually because the primary interest of the Europeans was in securing spices for Europe directly. In the olden days, the spices were carried to the Persian Gulf ports and then overland to the Mediterranean. And they soon learned that a simple bilateral exchange was not workable in the Asian markets. This was mainly because there was no demand in the local economies for the products of Europe. Okay, so other than gold or silver. So they soon learned that a simple bilateral exchange was not workable because their gold and silver it was not that much in demand, that much of much demand in this local in these areas. So, on the other hand, because of the universal demands in Southeast Asian markets, so they were in such the markets, it was in highly demand for Indian textiles, clothes from India served as a substitute medium of exchange. So, the demand for the painted fabrics of the Coromandel coast, that is Kalankari paintings, okay, and in the Indonesian islands. So the demand for the painted fabrics of the Coromandel coast in the Indonesian islands, in particular, made the Dutch and the English set up their establishments on the east coast to procure the cloth that could be profitably exchanged for spices. So, the demand for the painted fabrics of the Coromandel coast in the Indonesian islands, mm, it was in high demand in Indonesian islands. In particular, made the Dutch and the English set up their establishments on the east coast to procure the cloth that could be profitably exchanged for spices. So, they made the Dutch and the English set up their establishments. Were so it made the Dutch and English set up their establishments on the east coast. So the demand for the painted fabrics of the Coromandel coast in the Indonesian islands in particular made the Dutch and the English set up their establishments on the east coast to procure clothes that could be profitably exchanged for spices. Okay. So the next is collaboration with Indian merchants. From the beginning of their trading venture in India, the Europeans realized that they could succeed only with the help and collaboration of the leading Indian merchants. So, from the beginning of their trading venture in India, the Europeans realized that they could succeed only with the help and collaboration of the leading Indian merchants. So listen, from the beginning of their trading venture in India, the Europeans they realized that they could succeed only with the help and collaboration of the leading Indian merchants. So from the beginning of their trading venture in India, the Europeans realized that they could succeed only with the help and collaboration of the leading Indian merchants. Okay, collaboration with Indian merchants. From the beginning of their trading venture in India, the Europeans realized that they could succeed only with the help and collaboration of the leading Indian merchants. The merchants, on their part, saw in the Europeans a great new business opportunity for expansion and worked with them. In Surat, the merchants they were functioning with the security of the Mughal government to support them in case of any problems. But in Pulikat and Mughal government wasn't of any problems. So, but in Pulikat and later in Chennai under the English and Pondicherry under the French. Pulikat and later in Chennai under the English and Pondicherry under the French. The merchants also saw in these early colonial enclaves a place of security from where they could carry on business safely. That was the reason. So, it was very free from continuing political turmoil in the Tamil region. Okay, so the stability, they were looking for stability. The merchants, they were looking for mainly stability. At first, they looked for they looked the support of the Mughals and then the French, English and the French. Mainly French was in Portuguese and Pondicherry, and the English were in Pulicat and Chennai. So the Indian merchants were not at a disadvantage in their dealings with the Europeans till about 1700. So the Indian merchants were not at a disadvantage in their dealings with the Europeans till about 1700. And they were not at disadvantage with their dealings with the Europeans till 1700. So um, in Surat, the situation changed because of the threat posed by the Maratha incursions and the inability of the Mughal state to provide security. So in Chennai, um, the English had stabilized and they could put pressure on merchants to accept unviable terms in order to increase their exports of clothes to Europe. To increase their exports of clothes to Europe. Gradually, the power relations between the English and the local merchants began to change. The great merchant princes, who were the dominant players on the trading scene in the previous century, virtually disappeared. So in Chennai, the English had stabilized and they could put pressure on merchants to accept unviable terms in order to increase their exports of clothes to Europe. So the expansion of demand from Europe for Indian textiles. The expansion of demand from Europe for Indian textiles also had an impact on the indigenous economy. So the expansion of demand from Europe for Indian textiles. It also had an impact on the indigenous economy. Okay, there were high demand of for Indian textiles in Europe. So initially, this increased demand was beneficial to the local economy and the productive resources, that is land, labor, capital, and the raw materials, that is, and they could respond positively. However, as the demand from Europe continued to grow, the pressure to increase production exponentially began to strain the productive resources, and the frequent famines in the south and the shortage of food grains and raw materials, for instance, were additional burdens which the weaver had to bear. Thus, though the increased trade opportunities were beneficial in the short run, the long term effects there were not necessarily positive. So, over these 150 years, 150 years, the English in India from 1600 to 1750. So, over these 150 years, the English in India were gradually undergoing a metamorphosis from being traders to builders of trading empire. They were traders to trading empire, eventually emerging as the virtual rulers of large parts of the country. They were eventually emerging as what? As the virtual rulers of large parts of the country. Okay, so this is till now. As of now, we have discussed this, and the rest will be taken later. Okay, thank you.